The National Museum of Toys and Miniatures welcomes you to A Family at Play, the Nettie Wells Dollhouse. Join us as Curator of Interpretation Laura Taylor shares the history of the dollhouse created by Nettie Wells and her family, as well as the adventure she embarked on as a curator to discover the stories held by the dollhouse and its items. Nettie Wells and her family lived in the local Kansas City community during the 19th century and worked together to create a playful dollhouse whose items continue to tell the story of the little girl who played with it. In a time when many families are currently working together on projects for fun, we hope the story of Nettie Wells inspires creativity and invites you to think about the stories your own toys tell about you.
I'm Laura Taylor, Curator of Interpretation at the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures. One of my favorite projects that I've worked on at the museum is the research on the Nettie Wells Dollhouse. It was tucked into the corner of an exhibit we called the Farm Room before the renovation of the museum in 2015. And most people passed right by it because it wasn't very noticeable. But it caught my eye because of the craftsmanship, and it was very simple compared to a lot of the dollhouses that we have in the collection. And there was a little picture of Nettie Wells, the original owner, along with the notation that her dad built the dollhouse for her in the 1880s. So I was intrigued and I wanted to know more about Nettie Wells, but I couldn't have imagined how rich the project was going to be. Nettie Wells was born in Kansas City in 1877. She was the child of Harvey Jesse Wells, who came west from New York and worked for the railroad, and Ellen Wells, who was from Massachusetts. She was a cousin of the poet Emily Dickinson, and she came west with her family to Kansas to be Free Staters. Harvey, Jesse, and Ellen met in Paola, Kansas, and married and had Nettie. And Nettie weighed only 4.5 pounds when she was born. Back in 1877, before they had all of the medical advances that we have now, it was a challenge to keep her alive. And she was their only child, and they really doted on her. The dollhouse is very small, compact, and portable. It is just over 21 inches high, just over 16 inches wide, and just over 14 inches deep. And the Wells lived in boarding houses, so they didn't have a home of their own. So everything that went with the dollhouse could be packed up inside it. It opens with 2 transom flaps in the back, so it's more than likely, because of its small size, that Nettie pulled everything out of it to play around the dollhouse. In looking at it, you can tell that Harvey Jesse had some woodworking training. There are beautiful starburst appliques, fretwork trim, there's a chimney, there's glass windows, and there's even a frosted glass panel in the doorway. And he probably made this in the pattern shop at work. And it's entirely possible that he was using recycled wood to make the dollhouse. Harvey also made Nettie some really wonderful dollhouse furniture. There's a chair that was carved out of one piece of wood, a turtle-shaped table, a bed that has a mattress that's tied with blue floss, and a fainting couch or a chaise lounge, which would have been very popular in the later 19th century. There's also a really great little cart, and the cart has thread spool wheels. So throughout the dollhouse, there are all sorts of projects that were made out of recycled materials. Nettie's mother, Ellen, used the dollhouse to teach her about skills that she was going to need as an adult. So there's a lot of sewing projects in the dollhouse. There is a really lovely patchwork quilt that has print in it, in the patches that is the right scale for the size of the quilt. There are two crazy quilts, one that's more finished than the other one, so it's entirely possible that those were mother and daughter projects. And then there's a really extensive doll wardrobe of fancy dresses, everyday dresses, hats, underwear. There's even a costume that I think may have been a swimming costume. So some really beautiful fashion for the doll. But the doll was a little bit of a mystery for me. There was a little tiny doll, and there was a little pill box that had a notation on it that said, "Gracie's doll's clothes are in this box." I knew that the dollhouse doll was named Gracie because Nettie created all of these little books and note cards that somehow survived in the dollhouse. And Gracie's name came up several times, so I knew she was the dollhouse doll. But I thought it was odd because this little pillbox had clothing for this little tiny doll, and there was this whole other wardrobe. So I felt like the main wardrobe would have fit a larger doll. So I knew that this probably wasn't Gracie. One day I was poking through a box that was in the second story of the dollhouse, and it was a Colgate oatmeal soap box, and there were all of these little scraps of material and paper patterns for the dresses, and up popped this little bisque leg. I had been through that box before, and I had never encountered this little doll that I pulled out, and I knew instantly that this was Gracie Wells, that this doll was going to fit that amazing wardrobe. Also, I knew that this doll was not a doll that you would put on the shelf and appreciate as something pretty, because it was missing its head and two limbs. So I knew that Nettie had played with this doll, and it had been well loved, and it had been a very adventurous doll. You could tell from the stains on the underwear neck that it had the head had been glued on before. So instead of being sad about that though, I was really intrigued that this doll had survived and had such an adventurous life and adventurous spirit. Back to the little note cards and the books that Nettie made, I was really impressed to see those because it's very rare that children leave us that much evidence about their private narrative, about how they played with the toy. And so I was really excited to see those, and they yielded a lot of information that was really important. As I mentioned before, from those I knew that the dollhouse doll was named Gracie. And I also discovered that Nettie considered herself to be Gracie's mama. So Gracie wasn't a proxy for Nettie. Nettie considered herself the mistress of the house, and Gracie was her child. The little tiny doll that had the pillbox with the tiny clothes in it, and the pillbox said, "Gracie's doll's clothes are in this box," I realized that what that meant was Gracie's doll's clothes are in this box. This little tiny doll belonged to Gracie, so the dollhouse doll had a doll of her own. Also, through the books and the note cards, I learned a lot about Nettie's daily life. She was one of the first children to attend Sunday school in Kansas City. That was a new thing in the 1880s and 1890s. So she was one of the first children to do that here. And you can tell from these little books and note cards that she tried to give Gracie a Christian education. She also liked to play school. And there's one book that has sort of an attendance roster from her playing school. And the front of the book says Mrs. Nettie Wells, and then in the inside there are several children's names, including Gracie, who of course had perfect attendance. In the course of my research, I called the donor of the dollhouse, the person that gave the museum the dollhouse, a woman named Dottie, and I asked her if she knew anything about the dollhouse, and she actually said that Nettie was her grandmother, and she didn't really know that much about the dollhouse, but I could speak with her mother, and I was really excited to find out that I was going to meet Nettie's daughter. And she was in her 90s, and we visited several times. And one of the things that I asked her about was the completeness of the dollhouse, the fact that the little note cards and books had survived, the paper patterns for the clothing, so many things that were tucked away in that dollhouse. And what she told me was that when Nettie was 12 years old, the family finally moved into a home of their own. Harvey Jesse built a house on 39th Street, which is no longer standing. He built this house. It was a colonial revival house. They moved into it, and almost immediately, Nettie's mother, Ellen, became ill and couldn't take care of the house. So all of those lessons that Nettie had learned from playing with her dollhouse, she then had to use to manage her parents' household. And her playing time was very abruptly ended. So the dollhouse went up into the attic, and she became the manager of her parents' house. Another reason that it was so complete was that she never allowed either of her two daughters to play with the dollhouse. And, throughout the process, I felt Nettie's presence. I felt like, this was a story that needed to be told. And when I heard that, I realized that she had really preserved it as a time capsule. And it told us so much about her life, but it also told us about what it was like to be a kid during that period of time as well. As I was working through the research, different ideas began to come to me about how we were going to use it. And one of the things that we did was we created a little booklet about the dollhouse that had activities like making your own dollhouse bed. We also created a special exhibit about the dollhouse called A Family at Play. Working through this research and the story was a pretty important part of the direction that we wanted to go for our renovation. We knew that we wanted to tell more stories like Nettie Wells' story. And then one of the most enjoyable things that we did was we wrote an 8-minute monologue, and we hired an actress named Macy Steele to portray Nettie. And she gave a performance about Nettie's last day of playing with her dollhouse, which was really heartfelt and beautiful. And we got to have Jane, Nettie's daughter, come for that performance. Today, you can see the Nettie Wells Dollhouse in the Toys from the Attic exhibit. It has its own narrated story interactive, and it's a big centerpiece of that exhibit. And I hope you enjoyed learning about the Nettie Wells Dollhouse.
Toys tell the stories of the children who play with them. What stories might your cherished toys tell about you? We hope you've enjoyed A Family at Play, the Nettie Wells Dollhouse. Visit us online at toyandminiaturemuseum.org or connect with us on social media.